The desert stretched endless, a sea of dust and silence, where the horizon shimmered like molten glass. The sun was lowering, bleeding its last colors into the barren world, and in its fading light a young woman lay among the sand and stone. Her body was frail, her dress torn, her breath shallow as if each exhale might be the last. Her name was Arabella, only 22, though her eyes carried years of grief older than her flesh. Her family had brought her here, not as kin but as executioners. She had defied them, refusing the marriage they had pressed upon her. To them, her will was rebellion, a stain against their honor. To her, it was the single act that proved her soul still belonged to herself. When they bound her, when they carried her out into the wilderness, she thought at first it was only to frighten her. But when the rope was cut from her wrists and the wagon wheels rolled away, the truth stung sharper than the desert wind. They had left her to die. She remembered the last look in her father's eyes, hard, distant, as though she were no longer his daughter but a burden to cast off. She remembered the laughter of her brother, thin and cruel, echoing like a jackal's cry. Their figures vanished into the heat, and she was left alone with the silence of the land. Now, hours later, her lips were cracked, her skin burned, her body weak from the bleeding wound at her side. She pressed her hand against it, but the effort drained what little strength remained. Her whisper, dry as dust, slipped into the air, "Bury me here." She said it not in despair, but in defiance. Better the earth claim her bones than return to the cage they had built. The desert received her words without answer. Only the low whistle of wind, threading through rock and cactus, gave reply. Her eyelids grew heavy, the light dimming as though the world itself were closing. It might have ended there, her story swallowed by the sand. But fate has a way of bending toward those who still breathe against its weight. From the distance came the hollow thud of hooves, slow and steady. A horse moved across the horizon, carrying a man draped in black, his hat pulled low, his face half-shadowed by dusk. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, his posture weary yet unbending. His name was Jonas, though the desert knew him only as another rider who passed through its silence. He might have ridden on, for he had long practiced the art of keeping to himself. But as he neared the ridge, a faint movement below caught his eye, the twitch of a hand barely lifting from the sand. He reined in his horse, narrowed his gaze, and for a moment believed the desert was playing tricks. Yet there she lay, her body like a broken doll cast aside. Jonas swung down from the saddle. His boots sank into the sand as he approached, every step measured. He crouched beside her and brushed back the rough blanket that had half covered her body. The sight struck him harder than he expected. A girl not yet lost to the earth, her eyes half open, glimmering with fire though dulled by suffering. He pressed his palm near her lips. A breath stirred weakly against his skin. Her gaze found him then, unfocused but fierce, as if daring him to turn away. It was not the gaze of a beggar but of someone who had chosen her path, even if that path led to death. Something in it unsettled him, a cord pulled from deep within, one he had thought long silenced. He reached for his canteen, lifted her head with surprising gentleness, and let a trickle of water touch her mouth. She coughed, swallowed, then breathed a little stronger. Her whisper came again, raw and trembling. "Leave me." Jonas did not answer. He was a man of few words and fewer explanations. Yet his silence was not agreement. He slipped an arm beneath her, lifting her as if she weighed less than the sorrow he carried, and carried her to his horse. She protested weakly, striking at him with hands that had no strength, but he paid her no mind. He set her across the saddle before him, mounted, and turned the reins. The horse moved forward into the deepening dusk, hooves drumming like a heartbeat against the earth. Arabella pressed her cheek against the rough fabric of his coat, her eyelids too heavy to resist. She tried once more to summon the words to drive him away, but the warmth of his presence broke through the chill that had been wrapping around her bones. Jonas kept his eyes forward, the horizon etched with violet shadows. He did not know who she was, nor why she had been left to die. He knew only that the sight of her had shaken him to the core. For years he had walked this land alone, convinced he owed nothing to anyone. Yet in lifting her from the desert, something old and buried had stirred, a memory of promise, of duty, of the unbearable weight of letting another soul perish when he might have stopped it. The night rose around them, stars piercing the sky like 1,000 watchful eyes. Jonas tightened his grip on the reins, his other arm steady around her frail form. He rode on without pause, carrying her toward the small cabin that waited at the edge of the wilderness. Behind them, the desert whispered and settled, erasing the marks of struggle. The place where she had whispered "Bury me here" grew silent once more, holding its secrets in the sand. But the story was not buried with it. It had just begun. Snow fell in thin, soundless veils as Jonas guided his horse through the timberline. The cabin appeared slowly, a squat silhouette pressed against the pale hills, smoke curling from its chimney like a thread of fragile hope. He dismounted stiffly, his arms never loosening around the faint weight of the woman he carried. When the door creaked open, the warm breath of fire and wood filled the night, swallowing the cold. Inside, the place was simple, built of rough pine and stone. A single bed in the corner, a wooden table scarred by years of use, shelves lined with jars and tools. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. Jonas lowered Arabella onto the bed, arranging her as carefully as if she were glass about to crack. He stoked the fire higher, brought water, and set about cleaning the wound at her side with steady, calloused hands. Her eyes fluttered open in the glow of the flames. She studied him through the haze of fever, catching the lines carved deep into his brow, the quiet patience of his movements. He did not ask her name, nor speak a word of comfort. The silence between them was heavy but not cruel, a silence that held space rather than demanded it. The days that followed bled into one another, marked by the rhythm of firewood split, broth simmered, bandages changed. Arabella lay in stillness, her body healing, her spirit taut as a drawn bowstring. Jonas kept near but never intruded. His boots could be heard pacing the floorboards, his presence marked by the scrape of a chair, the hiss of water poured into a basin. He spoke rarely, and when he did his voice was low, gravel smoothed by restraint. At first she wondered if he despised her weakness. Yet as her strength inched back, she noticed the quiet precision with which he laid her blanket each night, the way he cooled her fevered brow with cloth dipped in melted snow. No demand followed his care. No question pressed her to explain the scars on her heart. She had known men who demanded obedience, who weighed women like cattle against the coin they could bring. Jonas seemed carved from another stone, silent, perhaps even stern, but unwilling to claim more than she offered. She tested her voice one evening when the wind clawed at the cabin walls. Her words rasped like brittle twigs. "Why did you not leave me?" He paused, his shadow long against the firelight. For a moment she thought he would ignore her, and perhaps that would have been easier. Instead he said, slow and deliberate, "Because I could not." Nothing more. He turned back to the kettle, as if the conversation had been concluded. Yet his reply rooted itself deep within her, stronger than any promise she had heard before. As the snow thickened outside, her strength grew. She could sit up, walk a few steps, place wood on the fire herself. Jonas allowed it, though he watched her carefully, always a half step behind in case her knees gave way. She sensed he carried his own burdens. An air of solitude pressed heavy on him, the kind born not from choice but from loss. What ghosts haunted him, he did not say. But she knew them by the weight of his silences. The world beyond their walls intruded only faintly. A boy from a neighboring farm rode by once a week, leaving flour and salt by the door, never lingering. An older woman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, appeared one afternoon with a basket of herbs. She looked at Arabella, then at Jonas, and her mouth pressed into a line that seemed both warning and compassion. "Sheltering the wounded brings questions," she said softly before leaving again. Arabella understood. Secrets did not stay buried long on the frontier. Still, the cabin grew into something more than refuge. It was a place where her breath no longer rattled with death's closeness, where her body no longer trembled from the cruelty of her kin. She learned the patterns of Jonas' days, the way he rose before dawn to tend the horse, the quiet moments he lingered at the door watching the snow as if measuring distance against memory. She found herself listening for the sound of his return whenever he stepped outside. Trust came slowly, like the thawing of ice beneath the first warmth of spring. One evening she joined him at the table. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon, though not from weakness. She felt his gaze upon her, steady but unreadable. At last she said, "You owe me nothing. You could send me away, and it would be no sin." He set down his own spoon, the shadows carving sharper angles across his face. "And to where would you go?" His voice was calm, but it carried a question that pierced deeper than it seemed. She had no answer, only the silence of one who has been stripped of home and kin. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. She looked at him then, truly looked. His hair was dark, threaded with the first signs of gray, his eyes not cruel but weathered, like stones polished by years of wind. He was not a man who sought to impress, nor one who seemed eager for company. Yet something in his bearing told her he had chosen, for reasons she did not yet grasp, to tether his fate to hers. That night, as she lay beneath the quilt, she thought of the desert and the words she had whispered into its dust. "Bury me here." How strange it felt now, to lie alive in a stranger's cabin, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breath from the chair where he slept. She closed her eyes, not in despair this time, but in the tentative comfort of knowing she was not abandoned. Beyond the cabin walls the snow deepened, muffling the wilderness in white silence. Within, two souls lay in the quiet space between strangers and something else unnamed. It was not yet trust, not yet love, but the fragile beginning of both. And though neither spoke it, both understood the world outside would not remain distant for long. The wind pressed hard against the cabin walls as if trying to slip inside, carrying with it the rumors of a world that refused to let either of them rest. Arabella was no longer confined to the bed. Her steps were steady now, though each movement carried a memory of pain. She had taken to small tasks, mending a torn shirt of Jonas's, arranging kindling in the hearth, stirring the pot that simmered over the fire. None of it was asked of her. She simply wished to carve her presence into the rhythm of the cabin, to prove that she was not only a burden rescued from the desert but a soul who still had worth. Jonas watched her quietly. His silences had grown softer with time, no longer walls but spaces where her voice might enter. Sometimes she caught him standing in the doorway, the shape of his shoulders cut against the snow-lit sky, as though he were measuring every horizon for danger. It comforted her in ways she could not admit, to know he was always watching even when he seemed far away. The first shadow of trouble arrived not with steel or blood, but with words carried by the farmhand boy. He appeared at the threshold one afternoon, cheeks red from the cold, his breath spilling white into the air. He set down a sack of flour and hesitated, shifting from boot to boot. "Strangers been asking in town," he murmured. "About a young woman gone missing. Family claims she ran off. Some folks say she dishonored her kin. They're searching the trails." His eyes darted toward Arabella before he lowered them, as though the truth might burn if spoken too openly. Then he was gone, leaving behind only the creak of the closing door and the echo of what he had delivered. Arabella's hands trembled as she set the sack upon the table. The words sank into her chest like ice. She knew her family would not give up quickly. Their pride was iron-bound, their anger a storm that could chase her across the frontier. She turned to Jonas, searching his face. He did not flinch, did not curse, did not show fear. He only said, "They will come." Those 3 words were not prophecy but certainty. His eyes met hers, steady as stone, and she realized he had already accepted the weight of what was coming. That night, unable to sleep, Arabella sat by the fire while Jonas worked quietly at the table. She had carried the burden of silence long enough, and the heat of the flames gave her courage. "They left me because I refused," she said, her voice hushed but firm. "My father promised me to a man I could not love. A man whose hands bruised everything he touched. I would rather die in the desert than live bound to him. So they cast me out. Their honor is worth more to them than my life." Jonas set aside the leather he had been mending and looked at her, his gaze deep but unreadable. She braced for judgment, for the tired refrain that a woman should yield to her family's will. Instead, he only asked, "Do you regret choosing your own life?" Her breath caught. No one had ever asked her that, not with sincerity. She shook her head slowly. "I regret nothing but the pain it caused." He leaned back in his chair, his silence heavy yet oddly comforting. She saw in his eyes the shadow of his own history, though he did not speak it. She understood then that he too had walked away from chains unseen, that the solitude he wore was not born of peace but survival. The days passed with an unease that grew like a storm brewing at the horizon. Arabella tended the fire, cooked simple meals, and with each shared task the space between them narrowed. She laughed once, softly, when Jonas fumbled a pot too large for one hand, and the sound startled them both. It had been so long since laughter lived on her tongue that it felt foreign. He glanced at her, a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps even a fragile spark of warmth. She clutched that moment close, as if it were a fragile flame in the dark. But shadows lengthened. Arabella dreamed of her father's voice at the cabin door, of her brother's hand gripping her arm, dragging her away from the fragile sanctuary she had begun to build. She woke in sweat, and Jonas was always there, sitting near, the outline of him etched against the dim glow of embers. Once, unable to hold her fear, she whispered, "If they come, they will not stop." He met her eyes with calm certainty. "Then they will find me standing between them and you." Those words rooted deeper than the fire's warmth, stronger than any oath spoken in church. He did not say it as a promise made to sway her, but as a fact already carved into the marrow of who he was. Still, the silence of the nights grew tense, the air thick with the sense of an approaching storm. The boy's warning lingered. The older neighbor woman passed once on the trail, her eyes sharp with knowledge, her nod a silent acknowledgment that danger was near. Arabella found herself torn between dread and a strange, blooming strength. For the first time, she was not alone in her defiance. Jonas, quiet as stone yet unshakable, had chosen to shelter her. Each day she felt less like a guest and more like part of the cabin itself, stitched into its timber and firelight. One evening, as the snow eased and the horizon burned with a dying sunset, Jonas brought her a bundle. Within lay her prairie dress, mended by his rough hands. The tears had been stitched with coarse thread, uneven but sturdy. She traced the seams with her fingers, her chest tight. "Why would you bother?" she asked softly. He did not answer, but the slight tremor in his hand as he set the bundle down was all the reply she needed. It was not charity, nor obligation. It was something quieter, something that reached toward the unspoken bond forming between them. That night, the cabin seemed smaller, the fire brighter, the silence almost tender. Arabella sat near Jonas, her mended dress folded across her lap, and felt for the first time that her life was no longer running from death but edging toward something worth holding. Yet she also knew, as the wind shifted outside and carried with it the distant echo of hoofbeats, that peace was fragile. The shadows were drawing closer, and soon the door itself would be tested. The storm came in with a roar, dragging clouds across the plains like black sails. Thunder shook the cabin timbers, and rain lashed the earth until mud and sky became one. Arabella stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched shadows moving in the distance. Horses, half seen through the sheets of rain, drew closer. Her heart knew them before her eyes did, her father's riders, men who had once been her guardians and now came as hunters. Jonas stood behind her, his presence steady, his voice quiet but firm. It's time. She turned to him, searching his face. There was no fear there, only the stillness of a man who had chosen his ground long ago. He lifted his rifle from its place by the door, checked the chamber, and set it down again. The message was clear. Words would be his weapon first, but steel waited if words failed. The hoofbeats grew louder until the cabin shook with their approach. Lanterns bobbed in the storm, and then came the pounding at the door, fists heavy with authority. A voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the rain. "Send her out. She belongs to her family." Arabella's body stiffened. Belongs. That single word pierced her more than the wound her kin had left in her side. She stepped back, but Jonas moved forward, opening the door with a deliberate calm. The storm spilled in, cold and wild, yet he stood like an unyielding wall. On the porch, her father glared from beneath his soaked hat, his eyes burning with pride wounded deeper than love. Behind him, armed men shifted uneasily, their coats dark with rain. Her brother sneered, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The air was thick with expectation, the storm outside a mirror to the storm within. "She is ours," her father barked. "You've no right to keep what is not yours." Jonas's reply was low, measured, each word struck like iron on an anvil. "She is no one's possession." He stepped aside just enough for them to see Arabella, standing tall despite the fear curling in her belly. Then he added, voice steady as the thunder above, "She is my wife." The words fell like a stone into deep water, sending ripples through every soul gathered. Arabella's breath caught, her heart surging with shock and something else she dared not name. Jonas had not asked her, had not staged this moment for show. He had simply declared it, not as a claim but as a shield. Her father's face darkened, his fury cracking through his mask of authority. "Lies. She is betrothed by my word. You shame us all by harboring her." Arabella found her voice, trembling but clear. "It is not shame to live free. It is shame to bind a daughter to chains." Her words cut the air, and for the first time she saw hesitation flicker in the eyes of the men behind her father. The standoff stretched, lightning tearing open the sky, the storm's fury wrapping around them all. Jonas's hand hovered near his holster, his stance calm but unyielding. He did not posture, did not threaten. His silence carried more weight than a drawn gun. Every man there understood that crossing him would mean blood spilled before the rain ceased. Her brother stepped forward, spitting through the storm. "You'll die for this, both of you." Jonas's gaze did not waver. "Then come and try." The moment stretched to breaking. Rain pounded the earth, horses stamped nervously, and the crack of thunder rolled like cannon fire. Then, as if the storm itself had made the choice, her father pulled back on his reins. His face twisted in bitterness, his pride too stubborn to yield yet too cautious to press further. "Keep her then. She's no daughter of mine." With that, he turned his horse, the others following reluctantly. Their lanterns bobbed into the distance, swallowed by the sheets of rain until the night reclaimed them. The cabin was left standing in silence, save for the ragged breath Arabella had not realized she was holding. Jonas closed the door and set the rifle aside. He turned toward her, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his dark eyes softened by something unspoken. For a moment the world held still, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the steady drum of rain on the roof. Arabella's chest ached with the weight of all she could not say. He had bound her to him in words before her enemies, and though no vows had been spoken between them, she felt the truth of it deeper than any ceremony. Slowly, she stepped toward him, her hand rising to rest against the damp fabric of his sleeve. The next morning the storm had passed. The sky was scrubbed clean, a pale blue stretching endlessly over hills that glistened with new life. At the edge of the cabin, the old neighbor woman arrived, her eyes knowing, her silence heavy with approval. She carried no book, no bells, only a ribbon she pulled from her apron pocket. With quiet hands, she tied it around Arabella's wrist, then Jonas's, binding them together before the fire. No witnesses, no grandeur, just two souls joined in defiance and choice. Arabella lifted her gaze to Jonas, her heart steady now. He had not rescued her for gratitude, nor claimed her to fill emptiness. He had stood beside her when the world tried to drag her back into chains. That, she realized, was the marrow of love, not firework passion, but the unmovable weight of someone who chose to stay. Outside, the earth steamed beneath the newborn sun, the wilderness wide and waiting. Inside, their hands remained bound by the simple ribbon, the silence between them no longer hollow but full. Arabella drew a slow breath, the words rising not as plea but as promise. "We begin here." And so they did. In the ashes of defiance, in the quiet strength of survival, a life began, one not stolen from the desert, but chosen in the storm.